Sorry, that's a real control freak thing. It gives me a little buzz of pleasure every time I do it. Plunge you all into darkness. Anyway, welcome back today, and I guess you're having a proper Mancunian welcome this particular morning. I hope no one's been struck by lightning. Right, okay, well, welcome to day 2 of the Summer Institute, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce today's first speaker, and that's Alecia Youngblood Jackson from Appalachian State University. Did I get it right? In the US. Alecia is now quite a long-standing friend and colleague and all-round good person, and today she's going to be giving you kind of a taste of the exciting work that she's been doing for several years now around really creatively putting theory to work. She's going to be talking, I don't know exactly today, but Alecia does work around Foucault. She's been doing quite a lot of work around Deleuze and Guattari. And of course, you've heard her name already mentioned several times in this Summer Institute already, because she's the co-author with Lisa Matze of a fabulous book called Thinking with Theory, which you absolutely must read if you haven't read it already, because that book mobilizes different kinds of predominantly post-structural theory to look at the same body of data, and it's a wonderful book, and Alecia is one of the co-editors. So today Alecia is going to talk about rhizovocality revisited. So I'll just introduce her. Alecia?
Good morning. Just this room is so vertical. I'm not used to that. I'm used to the so don't take my okay, so great. Let's get started. Thank you, Maggie, for that generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be here, and thank you to Barbara and Trish for organizing everything to get us here, and then everyone else you had working behind the scenes to create this experience. I did want to say one thing about my talk, because I was looking through the packet last night, and there is I'm focusing on Deleuze's refrain, Plateau 11 today, and I'm only taking it so far. And then tomorrow, during Wednesday's improv lab with the Visual Machine, they are also working with the refrain. So Jeff and I were talking about how this is going to be I will probably be doing some introductory work with the refrain and go so far with it. I don't deal with the music part of the refrain, and I guess they'll be picking up the music part. So it's going to be really nice to do that. So if what I present this morning doesn't make any sense, then you have another chance tomorrow to figure it out. So, all right, so the title of my presentation is Rhizovocality Revisited. And, like most titles, when I had to send this to Maggie, and of course she was so generous and said, you can change it whenever you want, and she knows I changed it about 8 times. And I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do, but I've been thinking about this article that I wrote in 2003, and it was just called Rhizovocality. And I was Betty's student at the time, and it was my comprehensive exam. And so I published that. I've been thinking about it for 10 years. I've been thinking about what do I want to do with this, because I wrote this thing, and then I just, like papers you write in grad school, you just make it go away and don't think about it for a while. So I want to play with that today, and so I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. So the title signifies both a movement back to some of my previous writing, only to bring it forward into a different type of analysis. And so the first paper was published in 2003, like I said, in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, which is called Rhizovocality. And in that manuscript, I critique the use and failure of voice in qualitative research from feminist, post-colonial, and post-structural paradigms. And what emerged within my thinking with Deleuze about voice was something of my own invention, what I coined as rhizovocality. And I describe rhizovocality in this way, and it's inspired by Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus. Rhizo, a prefix I borrow from Deleuze and Guattari's image of the rhizome, captures the heterogeneity of vocality in a spatial figuration, accentuating its connections to other things through its very diversity. Vocality in music theory emphasizes the performative dimension of voice, its expressive power, its tensions of dissonant counterpoint. It challenges our attention and demands deep concentration if we are to hear its nuances. Rhizovocality, as my combined invented signifier, offers a vision of performative utterances that consist of unfolding and eruptive threads. And I just made that up. Like Betty said yesterday, we just make these things up to see how they help us out. So I was trying to invent something new, and then I didn't really do anything with it. But I'm going to today, 10 years later. All right. So rhizovocality was another way of conceptualizing voice in qualitative research, and it was a concept that emerged from the layers of critique and made its appearance only in the conclusion of the paper. That is, I just left it there, unsure about where to go with it or how to work on it. I've continued to be vexed by voice in qualitative research. In fact, before Lisa Matse and I wrote Thinking with Theory, we co-edited a book published by Routledge in 2009. Is that right? Okay. Titled Voice in Qualitative Inquiry, in which we assembled manuscripts that grappled with the problematics of voice from a variety of perspectives. And both Betty and Maggie have chapters for that text. Betty St. Pierre and I recently co-edited a special issue of Qualitative Inquiry. It's not out yet, it'll be out next year, on data analysis after coding. And part of the impetus for that issue is the critique of voices data and how it is captured, coded, thematized, and represented in conventional qualitative research. And I'll mention also that writings from Lisa Matse, Jessica Ringrose, Hillary Lynn Taguchi, Kelly Clark Keefe, Rachel Holmes, and Stephanie Daza all have papers in that special issue. So anyway, so each of these projects that I've mentioned takes up critiques and attempts to undo research practices that remain attached to notions of voice inherited from metaphysics. Voice as present, as stable, authentic, and self-reflective. Voice is still there to search for, retrieve, and liberate. We see this paradigm functioning still in research representations when we read phrases such as let voices speak for themselves, or give voice, or make voices heard. So in my talk this morning, I want to continue that undoing by revisiting rhizovocality via the Summer Institute's theme of putting theory to work. So when Maggie gives us a theme like that, it's like a playground. You just think about what do I want to do, what do I want to play with, what do I want to see, what do I want to create. So back to Deleuze I went to put his experimental and generative ontology, an ontology that is a matter of creativity than discovery. So I put to work that. I go back to Deleuze and carry with me this thing called rhizovocality, and this time I drop into Deleuze and Guattari's Plateau 11, the refrain, in order to expand upon my argument of voice as rhizovocality, an expressive aesthetic with dimensionality, spatiality, counterpoints, and lines of flight. Putting to work Deleuze and Guattari's refrain makes me feel simultaneously bewildered and courageous. I don't know if that's how y'all feel when you read Deleuze, but at one moment I don't even know what I'm doing, and then I just feel like I can do anything. So that may be what happens here. So as I bounced around inside the landscape of Plateau 11, and that's how I read Deleuze, I skip forward, I back up, and I don't know if that works that way for you all, but he said at one point, read the book like you would listen to a record and skip around and pick up the needle and put it down wherever you want and pick things up. And so when I was reading, I scribbled a lot of questions in the margin. And so these are some of the ontological questions that came up for me. I'm not dealing with all of these in this paper at all. We would be here all day. But these are just some of the things that provoked me as I was reading. What happens when voice exceeds language and is more than unvocalized words emanating from a speaking subject? What happens if we take seriously the post-human and invert the normal equation of fixed human subjects producing and receiving voice as participants and researchers in our work? That is, what if voice organizes and disorganizes spaces in which not only humans but also other machines and objects and material forces coexist, change, and develop interactively? If the materiality of voice is not limited to sound, or if the materiality of voice is sound that can be something else besides self-present language emitted from a human mouth, how do we account for it? How do we critique what it is doing, the forces that it that create it as well as the forces it creates? And what are the becomings in and of the refrain? And I think those last two questions are the ones that I really do take up in the paper this morning. These are just a few of the ontological questions provoked in the middle of my reading. As Betty said yesterday in her presentation, any use of a concept, in this case the refrain, brings with it an entire ontology. So these questions on here aren't meant to be a starting point for analysis, but may help to provide some orientation on the landscape of the refrain. All right, so in the next section, I do some pedagogical things. I offer a close and what I hope is a generous reading of Plateau 11. I'm not going to claim accuracy. I focus specifically on the process of the refrain and gather up relevant terms such as milieu, rhythm, and territory. I stay close to the geophilosophical examples that Deleuze and Guattari offer, and then I follow by putting the refrain to work in an example from my own research on cheerleading. Okay, so in the first few pages of Plateau 11, Deleuze and Guattari outline three things that happen in a refrain. These aspects are not successive movements in an evolution, rather they're just three aspects of one thing that happens at the same time. First, a refrain is like a song that creates the beginnings of order and chaos, as in a child singing in the dark to ward off fear. And that's the example that they start the plateau with. Chaos in this sense is not necessarily anti-order in an extreme sense, but a threshold of disorder or degeneration. The beginning of the refrain is an organizing point that is directional, meaning the point is not inert, just hanging out there for you to land on. But it's mobile and it's going somewhere. We just don't know where. And taking things with it, but we don't know what it takes with it. The refrain, like a song, comforts. It locates a center that is fragile in its directionality and already in danger of breaking apart. Next, this is the second force at work, second of three. Next, a refrain marks a territory, an organization of a limited space with a circle drawn around it. The refrain is still fragile at this point because any mistake in speed, rhythm, or harmony would be catastrophic because it would bring back the forces of chaos. And that was a quote from the text. I forgot to do my start quoting quote. So think of a cat that sprays corners of her house and trees and bushes in the yard to mark a dimensional area that she claims is her possession. This territory, however, remains in danger of being re-territorialized by perhaps the removal of that outside species that drives the cat to make its mark, or even a human-based intervention such as spaying or neutering. And finally, cosmic forces. And this is the one that I'm still trying to get my head around, so maybe we can talk about it. The third aspect of the refrain is that the demarcated space defines a territory beyond it, but that is created by it, in the world or in the future as improvisation. Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, "One ventures from home on the thread of a tune. This thread of a tune is a deviation from the customary path. In an interview, Deleuze offers this, quote," and this is him speaking in something on YouTube. "When do I tra-la-la? When do I hum? I hum in three various occasions. I hum when I go around my territory, and that I clean up my furniture with a radiophonic background, meaning when I am at home. I also hum when I'm not at home, and that I'm trying to reach back my home. When the night is falling, anxiety time, I look for my way and I give myself some courage by singing tra-la-la. I go toward home. And I hum when I say, farewell, I am leaving, and in my heart I will bring," and then there's just ellipses. That's popular music. Farewell, I am leaving, and in my heart I will bring. That's when I leave my place to go somewhere else. In other words, the refrain for me is absolutely linked to the problem of territory and of process of entrance or exit of the territory, meaning to the problem of deterritorialization. I enter my territory, I try, or I deterritorialize myself, meaning I leave my territory. Deleuze and Guattari in Plateau 11 theorize that territorialization is a function of what they call the refrain. For Deleuze and Guattari, territorialization is not a, quote, permanent arrangement, but a constant process of formation and dissolution. What is important for Deleuze and Guattari are the processes or lines of flight that are available for the formation of desired rhizomatic or nomadic territories. Coupled with this is the necessity for the unmaking of undesired territories that are formed by what Deleuze and Guattari call, quote, the apparatus of capture, which capture lines of flight or lines of escape. Territories are not only literal lands in physical areas, but also fields of ideas, thoughts, and activities. But more so, they all imply process. The individual is only one part of this series of processes. Other social and material machines cannot be excluded. The human subject may be one agent within the formation and dissolution of territories, but this agent is also formed and constantly changed within these territorializing processes. So how does the refrain fit into this process? Refrains are portable. They move, and thus they create territories. Every repetition of a refrain marks out a distance, which also becomes a plane for the territory. Therefore, the creation of territory is the very function of the refrain. The use of the refrain reveals the processes used to make the territories. As I've already mentioned, these refrains do not simply emanate from a human subject, but are part of what Guattari calls a machinic heterogenesis, in which humans, their society, their environment, and technologies all produce the process of territorialization. For Deleuze and Guattari, the refrain has, quote, an essential relation to a native, because it always carries the earth with it. Mark Bonta and John Protevi offer this example. The base example of the refrain is that of the territorial birds that sing or call to mark off their territories from others of the same species and carve them out from the milieu of the forest. Avian territories are drawn and constituted by the refrain that is itself a becoming earth of the bird. For example, to claim a sound space, understory rainforest birds emit a series of hollow hoots and other sounds that are adapted to the qualities of that space. The refrain not only creates and holds the territory, but also becomes the motif or the repeatable theme of the landscape. It is portable, and therefore the refrain can be carried to alien milieus that can be territorialized as it is expressed there, even as it undergoes continuous variation. This example shows how Deleuze and Guattari conceive of the process of milieus becoming territories, becoming landscapes via the refrain. In some, pieces of milieus are assembled into a heterogeneous territory. To put another way, territories are fashioned from fragments of milieus that have meaning and function for the territorial assemblage. Territories contain that which is owned or used, actually or in reserve, waiting to be used. Territories intermingle in landscape and create a machinic opera. Think back to territorial birds. So an idea of an opera, I mean, really think about all the voices that you're hearing simultaneously that are doing different things in that song. So think back to territorial birds. Diverse birds all sing their own territories for different functions and with different qualities and expressions. But together they form a landscape of song, a heterogeneous terrain that interweaves milieus and territories in specific places. So Deleuze and Guattari are obviously extending these notions to the human and to the human interaction with the non-human. As with the territory of birds, the refrain must always be considered with reference to the ground on which grounds it, which grounds the organism, and the territory that the organism is able to negotiate and potentially carry to other territories in a process of re-territorialization. And in that little section, they have this sentence in there that says, we're not writing in circles. But it really feels like they were writing in circles in that part. So anyway, I know it may feel like that right now, but I'm getting to a concrete example here in a moment. All right, so if a refrain draws from a milieu to mark a territory and create movement and improvisation, that's the basic function of it, how does this process work? The refrain is a rhythmic process that draws upon three forces: chaotic, territorial, and cosmic. I'll return to these forces when I go to my example from cheerleading, but for now I want to stay with the primary terminology of the refrain, the milieu, and the rhythm. So according to the Oxford Dictionary of Geography, if you ever want to know a word, you just look in the dictionary, right? So I looked this up just to make sure that I was thinking of it in the best way. A milieu is the sphere in which each individual lives, and which he or she is affected by. This sphere includes the tangible objects and people, the social and cultural phenomenon, the images which influence human behavior. Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the refrain is entirely geophilosophical, so this definition of the milieu is useful. Furthermore, Deleuze and Guattari's milieu includes not only surroundings or external conditions, but also the internal stuff of our bodies, both human and non-human. The mixing of the external and internal is the typology that Deleuze and Guattari described when they wrote, "Every milieu is vibratory, a block of space-time constituted by the periodic repetition of the component. Thus, the living thing has an exterior milieu of materials, an internal milieu of composing elements and composing substances," and I would add that these substances are decomposing as well. An intermediary milieu of membranes and limits, and an annexed or associated milieu of energy sources and actions and perceptions. So I'll give you some examples of these. So for example, let's take a human body. The human body's exterior milieu is the total of all the materials accessible to it. So everything that's material that it can access is the exterior milieu. Its internal milieu is its composing and decomposing systems and the organs and the tissues that support them, the circulatory, the digestive, the muscular, the nervous systems, and so on. The intermediary milieu is the shell that surrounds it, the skin, but also other floating signs and semiotic productions and constraints that shape subjectivity. While these boundaries limit, they're also mobile. And finally, its annexed or associated milieu is the material that it uses, such as clothes, food, and speech, as well as the sources of that material, such as language, religion, place, and so on. Materialities that are bound to culture in particular ways. So how does the milieu fit into the refrain? The milieu gives materiality to the refrain and is the soup of the particle flows and strata that support assemblages. So now we have rhythm. And this is the other piece of the refrain that's really important. Rhythm becomes important here because rhythms connect milieus. Rhythms of a refrain are always in the middle, in between at least two milieus. Rhythm is about becoming. It is the difference which is the rhythm, not the repetition. A refrain that is repeated the same way with the same tempo is not connective or relational or generative, it's simply repetitive. As Andrew Murphy wrote, if rhythm was not becoming, connection, or interaction, if it could not deal with difference but only the dogmatic repetition of meter, nothing new would ever happen. No milieus would ever interact. New territories would never be made. For a rhythm to connect milieus, it must bring attention to the spaces and the intervals between them. How distant and different are, so you might ask the question, how distant and different are these milieus in my life? The rhythmic, how close together might they be? So there's this interval work that goes in with rhythm. The rhythmic function of the refrain brings together milieus and pushes them apart in undulating fashion. Think again to the child singing in the dark to ward off fear. If the fear does not dissipate, does the refrain speed up? Does it slow down? It all depends on the function and the qualities of the milieus that are forming the territory, as well as the chaotic forces that render the frame fragile in its becoming. Rhythm is intensive when it brings attention to those intervals, those spaces, that difference, bringing order to chaos. So the repetition of rhythm in a refrain is not temporally exact. If it were, a refrain could not be made for territorialization. As Deleuze and Guattari write, quote, "It is the difference that is rhythmic, not the repetition. It is a repetition so as to keep producing the territory." The most important point here is that a refrain, although it creates a territory, is not the same as what Deleuze and Guattari see as striated space that is static and anti-productive. The formation of territories through the rhythms of the refrain is a completely different process. Rhythm enables one to set oneself free from stratification and produce new territory. The comfort of a song can be picked up and used in an array of frightful circumstances, sung differently each time, allowing escapes that are new becomings with the world and openings to creation. All right, finally, let's sum up. The refrain opens up potentialities of new expressive forms, of new becomings. Refrains are drawn from chaotic and cosmic forces and are essential to establishing a territory or a home or an abode. Anybody possessing a refrain can carry it with them as protection, as that body, quote, wanders out on lines of drift, end quote. That's from Thousand Plateaus. As Bonta and Protevi wrote, the refrain becomes the sonorous shell of the body and accompanies it through whatever relative re-territorialization it undertakes. Refrains are repeatable, portable, and enable the holding together of many heterogeneous elements. They mark both distance and rhythm and enable different territories to be formed. At the same time, the refrain is the most unstable segment of the territory because the refrain comes from and is ultimately going somewhere else. The distributional force of the center of the territory is always from somewhere else. It must be to be able to form the in-between, which is crucial to the formation of territory. And finally, refrains have a catalytic function to make new affects. Particularly, they are made to attract, not repel. Think of the colors of a coral fish and the songs of a sounds of songbirds, and how they draw in. Okay, so now I turn to a landscape of cheerleading in order to work the refrain. Earlier I explained that I invented a new word, rhizovocality, because I didn't want to use the word voice any longer to talk about data, especially speech data. I wanted to think about rhizovocality as eruptive, as becoming, as both directional and dimensional, going somewhere and taking on new forms and taking new forms with it. Creating, not representing, and not limited to voice. Because the refrain can refer to any rhythmic pattern that stakes out a territory, it is also not limited to sound. The refrain may be eminently sonorous, as Deleuze and Guattari explain, but they also say that everywhere in nature there are gestural, visual, and postural refrains. I mean, think about, mating dances of animals and peacocks and things like that. So I want to take on the minor form of the refrain, refuse the hierarchy and absolute criteria of refrain as sound, and work the refrain as all those expressions in an ontology of creativity and becoming. And so I'm not saying that there's not sound in this or speech, but there are also all of these other movements and gestures that combine together to create a refrain. So it's not always just a song. There's other things that go to that. So I go to cheerleading to do this. So we'll see how this goes. All right, so I'm going to be crass again and refer to something else I wrote because I wanted to go back to this data and redo it. I do that a lot, and Lisa and I kind of got into this habit of looking at data over and over differently to see how we could really, in Foucault's words, make it groan and protest. So at this point, I go back to another article that I published in QSE titled Deleuze and the Girl. In that paper, and that was a special issue that Lisa Matze and Kate McCoy co-edited. In that paper, I wrote about becoming in the context of a cheerleading backflip. I read excerpts from that article and flatten out that previous analysis in order to palpate the process of the refrain. Cheerleading is an interesting landscape within which to pose this relation between the refrain and becoming, as cheerleading is a highly conforming territory with seemingly little heterogeneity. So we're going to watch something. We're going to watch some Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders for you. And there's a reason for these in particular. Almost done. No. Okay. We'll just stop that. Okay, stop talking. Okay. I just had to. And the reason I really wanted to pull the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders because they're so iconic in U.S. culture and NFL football. So this really was for the benefit of our international audience who might not know what I am signifying when I refer to this cheerleading where I'm going. Okay, so where am I? All right. So keep the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders routine in mind, particularly the hip gyrations and things like that. As I read now from my article. And I really do have a serious rationale for showing the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders because the research that I was doing at the time was in the rural South. If y'all seen the movie or watched the TV series Friday Night Lights, it's very much like that, where football reigns supreme on Friday nights and everyone in town is there and the cheerleaders do that. It's very much Dallas Cowboy cheerleader type. It's not this sport, athletic, gymnastics type of cheerleading. It's that, dancing and all of that. Okay. So just that's the territory that is that's there or was there when I was doing my research. All right, so keep all that in mind as I read from my article, because when I begin to show the refrain, that territory there, or that milieu, even pieces of that territory become important for difference and how the refrain is activated in this research. Okay, so I'm going to offer two snippets from this previous article. There's a lot of you who've heard this, who've read it, so just bear with me. I presented this at AERA a few years ago, and I know Hillary was in the room. So you'll hear it again. Anyway, it's obviously, what I'm reading here is obviously both description and inscription, but I need it to get us going on how the refrain builds in its encounters with forces of chaos. So I'm just going to begin to read about Jesse. So, yours is the most recognizable car in the senior parking lot. The phrase, "no doubt," is printed in all caps at the top of the front windshield of your black Chevy Cavalier, displaying your fascination with Gwen Stefani, the lead singer of the band No Doubt, a rock star who appeals to your punk sensibilities. You step out of your car and begin to walk slowly up the gentle hill toward the school, comfortable in your own skin. Rather than a backpack, you carry a black Adidas gym bag slung on your shoulder. You are petite, tiny, and stocky like a gymnast, and the gym bag bounces around well below your hips, almost to your knees. You wear baggy sweatpants, a black tank top, and flip-flops. You ought to be wearing your cheerleading uniform today. There's a pep rally this afternoon and a basketball game tonight. The expectation is that on game days, you overcode your body with molar constraints. You parade around school in your short skirt, you remove your piercings, you tame your wildly layered hair, you decorate the team's lockers with ribbons and candy, but you do not do those things. You edge around the front of the school and reach the basketball gymnasium. You have a very brief cheerleading practice this morning. You grasp the door handle, roll your eyes, and yank open the door. You know what is about to happen. You enter the empire of life, Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, occupied by molarized bodies and a bundle of complex forces of rules, laws, traditions that form those bodies into docile substances. There stand decades-old cheerleaders, decked out bow to tie in red and black school spirit. Tight ponytails bound by curly ribbons, halter tops, 10-inch pleated skirts, skin tanned from UV sunbeds. They are heiresses of habitual patterns and normalities of femininity and sexuality. They dress to entertain, they move to seduce. Molarity is desire, fitting in is desire. They wear the uniform with pleasure, hyper-aware of its sexiness and power. They enter the social contract of molar existence. They actualize. You drop your bag on the bleachers. You and the others automatically assemble into a staggered double lineup on the gym floor. You are front row center, still dressed in your un-uniform. The chanting begins with simultaneous clapping, sharp movements of arms and legs, bright smiles, synchronized, coexisting bodies in a shared environment. The routine follows a molarized trajectory, a cheer that you inherited, a cheer that has habituated, a cheer that you hate. The unhinging begins, the final move arrives. The girls who frame you spin around in their places, lift up the back of their skirts, and expose the mascot paws emblazoned on their bloomers. 3 girls in the back row gyrate and rotate, churning their hips. A few other girls shake their hips a little less vigorously. But you stand there facing forward, untrained. You move from this general to your singular in your becoming. There is friction in this molar machine. It's unresolved. The school bell rings, indicating the start of the school day. Molars scatter, doors slam, feet stomp, girls cry. The future is contaminated and in ruins. And that's the end of the representation. This entanglement of the material and discursive is a glimpse into a portion of Jesse's milieu. It is one of many milieus, but it will give us an in-between place for entering the territorial assemblage to see how refrains are made.